Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And my name is Francisco Herrera, and my pronouns are he, him, and mother.
In this episode, we'll discuss the fifth Sunday in Lent, which this year falls on March 21st. We talk about violent dictatorship and political assassinations in our deep dive about Óscar Romero.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Today for our deep dive, we have our special guest, Francisco Herrera. He is a queer Latino Lutheran theologian and historian, a Christian agitator, musician, and performer, and PhD student at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, researching intersectionality and church planting.
So before we get to our deep dive topic, Francisco, you recently reached ABD status, all but dissertation, for your doctorate. Congratulations!
Woohoo!
Could you tell us a bit about what you're studying and why you were drawn to it?
Well, I'm fundamentally an evangelist at heart. And one of the sad things is that even in a supposedly progressive denomination such as the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, that makes many commitments to things like justice and to gender equality and equal representation and leadership opportunities for people of color, people from the indigenous community, sexual minorities, and all of those things. Of course, that doesn't happen very often at all in real life. Mm-hmm. And because of that, people in our communities either die a slow death because they're going into white cishet churches with default settings that nobody really knows how to or can care to change. Or they go into these same communities and they're just beaten and lost and they die. And I'm very, very explicit about that. So instead of trying to focus on reforming existing church spaces and to try to get them to see people like myself as a human being, I am more interested in creating the communities that need to exist now. And thankfully, there are communities that do exist like this now. And that is what my research is. I'm going to be studying communities like this and specifically to see how they stay together. Because let's face it, one of the nice things about being in a community that looks a lot like you and where there are a lot of people that look like you is that it's just easier to show love and sympathy and support when you have more things in common with people. It's much harder to do the more diversity you have, and not just diversity of race and ethnicity, but also gender and sexuality, class, ability, disability, those kinds of things. But there are communities that exist like that now, and so I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time among them, seeing how they actually do what they do. But that's what really interests me, is between my very, very deep love for Jesus and my desire to share the healing power of the gospel with any and everybody all over the world, and the fact that there are so few churches I can actually invite people to, I need to do something about that. And that's my call.
That's awesome. That is a powerful call for sure.
Absolutely. And direly needed.
Direly.
Yes.
People die. That's not an exaggeration.
Okay, that wasn't an intentional pun.
Well, no. I get that. I get that.
No, I also was like, speaking of people dying.
Yay, death! We can't get away from it, so we might as well joke about it, you know?
Yeah, otherwise you die.
Otherwise you die, true.
One of the reasons that we have you on for this episode is because our gospel reading from John evokes a quote from Archbishop Óscar Romero, for whom both you and I have considerable affection. So can you tell us a bit about who he was?
Archbishop Óscar Romero was born in the 1920s in El Salvador, in a region of the country that was very close to Honduras. His family was poor. His mother, pretty much maintained the house. His father worked mostly doing what was common for people in the area at the time, is that they would help out to grow coffee beans and squash and other kinds of agricultural goods, both for eating for their own family, but also for sale. His dad also worked as a handyman in the area, another common source of employment. He even worked as a postman from time to time. But Romero grew up poor, but he showed a very early aptitude for study. He was always very focused and loved to learn, but he was also a devoted son of the church very early on. And so at the age of 13, as was so often for people with those gifts, he was essentially entranced into what they called the minor seminary in Santa Maria, which is one of the larger cities in El Salvador. A minor seminary is basically a high school for people that are considering entering the ministry. He did marvelously in his studies, so much so that eventually he finished up his divinity studies in Rome during World War II. And so much so that he actually lived through the final months of the war, frequently going hungry. There was a special college that was there specifically to house seminary students from Latin America. So he had to deal with hunger, and he saw bombing raids, and so it was pretty rough. But eventually, when things were kind of winding down, he had begun his doctoral studies. In particular, he was wanting to write on the mystical writings, I can't remember the name, but of a 17th century Spanish mystic and sort of church person. But his bishop called him back, and so he returned to El Salvador and began his very, very long career as a pastor. He worked for a number of years in the parish. He was deeply respected, not only as a preacher, but also as somebody who really spent time among the people, got to know families, frequently coordinated aid for families that were in need, worked to use the resources of the church for the sake of things like education. But very early on, his skills as an administrator were observed. So in very short order, he essentially became a secretary to all of the bishops in El Salvador. And he was in this capacity for several decades. During this time, he was theologically quite conservative. He was not one that was particularly involved in any of the political foment that was really common in El Salvador in particular, but in Central America especially. He was really more interested in being a member of the church. So even though he had colleagues the same age, younger colleagues who were much more into some of the theological developments that happened throughout the middle of the 20th century, especially with the advent of liberation theology in the late 60s, he didn't really take so much interest in that. Then things started to change in the late 60s. In 1968, there was an important meeting of bishops in Latin America, CELAM, as it was called. That's the acronym. I can't remember what CELAM stands for. But this is when all the bishops of Latin America got together to have a conference to talk about the conditions of their people, who had been living at that point for decades in significant poverty and with political isolation and persecution, frequently persecution and isolation funded by the United States government. And this is where the phrase comes from about the idea that God has a quote-unquote preferential option for the poor. That was part of the document that they produced from the meeting in the Medellin in Colombia, the conference 1968. And then, of course, that was also in response to Vatican II, which it had completed a few years just before that. And there was this idea that we were going to bring the Roman Catholic Church into the modern era in everything from using the vernacular languages, using cultural components, that these things no longer would be completely tied to everything that had happened in Italy in the 17th and 16th century. Romero certainly appreciated the reforms for modernization, but he was mostly interested originally in these reforms because of the fact that they took the church so seriously. The church as having a presence in the broader society. The church that not only lived and suffered with the poor, but that also cultivated its faith. That was his primary interest. However, things started to change significantly when he was elevated to what they call an auxiliary bishop. I believe this was in 1972. And as an auxiliary bishop, his job was basically to be the assistant to the bishop, who was also a bishop. And it was once again in Santa Maria, where he had done his own studying when he had been in the minor seminary there. And he started to see what the actual treatment was of the peasants. And for him, the moment that it really started to come together was that he realized that there were children that were dying from poisoning. They were being poisoned to death because of the water, because of the kinds of treatments that the coffee plantations were using to prepare their product, that it produced, I think it was some of the runoff was terribly poisonous for the body. And so he said, I suddenly had to see all of these children that were dying only because they drank water. This is when he started to have his conversion that took more or less about 5-6 years, where he just started to see over and over again the kinds of things that the political and economic exploitation of the country was causing upon the vast majority of the parishioners in his parishes and in the diocese where he worked. This all kind of came to a head in 1976-77 when the then Archbishop was preparing to retire and announced his retirement, and they were waiting for a successor. The successor, everyone had assumed, was going to be the man who had been sort of the assistant to the Archbishop at that time, a guy named Demas. But as it turned out, that isn't what happened, and when the election happened, it was Romero who was made Archbishop. This was an enormous shock, not only because Romero himself, wasn't jockeying for the role, not only because he didn't have really any experience, but because he the reason why he was chosen was because they saw him as being kind of a good, ready conservative. He was not someone that was known to engage in theological debate for the sake of the poor. He was not known as being radical or interested in liberation theology in any way. I keep mentioning this school in Santa Maria. When he was made the bishop of Santa Maria, in fact, one of his first acts that he did was to eject all of the liberation theology teaching faculty from the minor seminary in Santa Maria, because he believed that they were undermining the role of the church, that there should be a clear demarcation between what the church does and what government does. And he was pretty firm on that for the vast majority of his career. Then he was named Archbishop, and he was elevated. And of course, there were discussions because the lead up to the civil war in El Salvador was heating up. Militias and soldiers had already started actually beating and expelling priests from El Salvador. Not killing them yet, but certainly leading that way. And the thought was Romero would come in as a mitigating influence. He would kind of calm the things down. Well, they made one big mistake, however. There was a priest, Rutilio Grande. Rutilio was one of Romero's longest friends. They were good colleagues for many years. They had very, very different stances on their politics, but they were both deeply dedicated to the church. Also, Rutilio Grande was he was the liturgist for Romero's service when he was first elevated as bishop in 1972. So that's how close they were. Mm-hmm. And Romero hadn't even been archbishop for 3 or 4 weeks. And then all of a sudden he gets a phone call. Father Grande, had been driving between 2 parishes to perform baptisms. His car was stopped. It's well depicted in the movie. His car was stopped, and then militiamen came out and riddled it with bullets from AK-47s. And in the process, killing everyone in the front seat, which included Father Grande, a 70-year-old man, and a 12-year-old boy. There were 3 children in the back seat, fortunately, that weren't killed, but you could imagine the impact that had. Romero knew about the assassination within an hour or 2, and his first response, mind you, Romero had been a pretty dogged centrist, kind of on the conservative side, and his response to this was really, truly breathtaking. He drove to the city where the massacre had happened, saw Grande's body and the body of the older man and the boy. In his first response, he went back to San Salvador, and he ordered, and he could do this as Archbishop, that every single parish in the entire country be closed the following Sunday. So if you wanted to have Mass in all of El Salvador, you could not go to anywhere except the main cathedral in San Salvador. Wow. And that day,
for Catholics, that's big.
We're not done yet. And he had a funeral for all of the people that were killed in the massacre. Grande, the older gentleman, and the boy, all together. So he I think this was just like a turnaround of maybe 3 days or 4 days tops. Mm-hmm. He forced the entire country to participate in the funeral of these people who were massacred by a militia. The Roman Catholic Church at the time had a radio station, so the service was also broadcast over the radio, and he made it abundantly clear to everyone who was listening that this kind of violence was not tolerated, that it was a sin against God, essentially threw his lot very publicly in with war and with those who were fighting against government repression. The process of his transformation had been happening for, over the course of several years. Mm-hmm. But when they killed one of his closest friends and 2 of his friends' parishioners, both an old man and a young boy, that was it. And from then, for the remainder of his life, for 3 years, he was a tireless advocate for the poor. He helped to establish legal aid foundations to help peasants who were either defrauded by landowners. He helped with the organization of the unions. He didn't necessarily give direct support, but he did his best to try to help people to be able to do the work of the organizing that they did. He regularly acted as something as a go-between whenever there were radical political elements, agitating certain parts of the country, usually in universities or in certain government buildings. He frequently was called upon to sort of be someone to lower the tenor so people could talk. He was greatly respected by the people. And all this continued pretty consistently for about 3 years. He even wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter, specifically requesting him to stop funding the military government in El Salvador because they were killing people. Mm-hmm. He traveled all over the world to try to draw attention to what was happening in his country. He worked under 2 popes. So the first was Pope Pius VI, who at first was very supportive and greatly appreciated the work that he was doing and basically said, keep going, be brave, Christ is with you. Then he had to deal with John Paul II. John Paul II himself knew a thing or two about standing up against government because he had largely come to prominence because of his leadership in Poland during the time of the communist occupation of Poland, essentially. So he knew a thing or two about standing up. Many of the insurgents who were active against the military government, and the military and the government were themselves Marxist and communism in bent. So he took a very hard line against Romero, and essentially, in his last meeting with Romero before Romero was assassinated, essentially stripped him of all of his powers. He was put under the oversight of a committee of other bishops in the country who were largely critical of Romero, and essentially told him that he wasn't allowed to make any executive actions on the running of the archdiocese without approval from this committee and from the Vatican itself. So it was rough for Romero, but he was really truly living in the call of the gospel. And even though the radio station, the Catholic radio station, was bombed because they were so upset with the fact that he was constantly making broadcasts on behalf of the poor, there was even a time that, in addition to Romero's own advocacy for the poor within the country, but the fact that there were also, by this time, priests were actively joining the armed rebellion. One of the slogans that went throughout the militant factions in El Salvador was, "Be a patriot, kill a priest." So this was what he had to deal with. And this is what he continued to deal with until March 24th, which is basically this week, Lent 5, March 24th in 1980, when, as was one of his regular duties, he went to go to preside over the Eucharist for a group of nuns that were working as nurses in a hospital. He actually lived on the grounds of the hospital in a very, very humble sort of quarters with a small kitchen, a place to read and to sleep. And as he was presiding over communion, he raised the chalice up over his head as he was saying the words of institution. And an assassin's bullet at that moment shot him through the heart and was killed instantly. So his own blood spilled with the blood of our Lord. The shock was total because he was so genuinely revered by the people. He has a witness to the gospel that I think is worthy of emulation because he was a man that came from true humility. He, because of his education and access to status, because of being a member of the church and of the priesthood, brought him essentially into the upper echelons of Salvadoran society. But when he had to make a stand, he used every drop of his privilege possible for the sake of not only proclaiming the gospel, but to preach liberation to the captive, sight to the blind, and to declare the year of the Lord's favor. And so I have a very deep love for him.
A heel face turn like that is an impressive one. So between the poisoning of the children from the runoff from the coffee farms and then also the death of his close friend, it really sounds like the major catalyst in his life for the change he went through and the point of view change that he had was personal connection, personal relationship.
Yeah, and he had spent so much of his life doing precisely that. He never forgot where he came from. He never forgot he was nothing himself more than a poor peasant boy, even though he had certain, for lack of a better word, antiquated 19th century perspectives of what the church was, let alone needed to be. As soon as he saw really the depth of what was happening in his country, he changed pretty quickly.
Yeah.
What was interesting for me especially is when his early responses, when he started to see the kinds of things that the landowners were doing in the country. One of his first responses to tell to friends was, we need to evangelize the oligarchs. He really believed that it was a question of speaking to them and talking with them and letting them understand the impact of their actions. He, on some level, really believed that they could still care or that it was somehow an accident. And so there was a sense of compassion that he had. But part of that was also very much naivete because he was one of you. And he was one of the elite from the time that he returned from his education at the Vatican. I mean, he may have been living very humbly. He may have been living and having his life among them. But he was still a priest. And then eventually, basically, a secretary for bishops. And then himself a bishop. So he always inhabited this upper echelon of Salvadoran society. That's something else that in the movie that came out in the 80s, Romero, about his life, did a good job of showing. He was seen as being one of us, one of the upper classes.
I remember a scene of, I think it was like a party or a celebration of something, and it was maybe right before he was named Archbishop. And there's like a hint at some discomfort, but he is very much in the group. Yeah.
And one of the other things that happened in that movie in particular, there was a politician, Silas, who was sympathetic to land reform, but he eventually was actually kidnapped by insurgent rebels and was killed. And in the movie, Romero has a relationship with his wife. And it is interesting to see how his relationship to the elite of El Salvador is expressed in the relationship to this man's wife. How at first he was given really fancy furniture and performing baptisms and invited to all these things. But when Romero insisted, when she came and he said, look, my son, he's about time for his baptism. Can you please come? And he goes, we do all baptisms in the church. You come and be baptized with all of everybody else. And she's furious. You expect me to have my son baptized among those people. And that actually happened too. It didn't necessarily happen with a specific person, but that was a conversation that he had had. He was doing everything he could as a priest. That's the other thing that makes him really nice. He wasn't an activist per se. He was first and most importantly a priest and an archbishop. But in the role as priest and archbishop, he did everything he could to force the oligarchs to confront the sufferings of the people in very real ways, and always as a representative of God's will on earth. I especially like that stance. And the movie itself has a really marvelous scene where there is a church that is being occupied by soldiers. Everyone's been kicked out. And Romero and his assistant drive up in this little Fiat. And so Romero goes in to get the host. So there's a box where they keep the wafers for communion. And he goes and he starts getting the hosts. And there's an American soldier there. And to intimidate him, takes an M16 and then, fills everything with bullets and scatters the host everywhere. And so Romero gets up and leaves, composes himself, comes back, starts picking up the wafers, the host, from the ground, and then eventually he's grabbed again and thrown out of the church. At this point, he straightens himself up, gets into his car. This actually did happen. Gets into his car, his driver drives back. Romero then returns, puts on all of his vestments as the Archbishop of San Salvador, and then processing with all of the people who had seen this entire scene, walks up to the door of the church, stares down the soldiers, and then goes in, takes the host, and conducts a mass. And that actually happened. So for me, if there's something that I don't like about more progressive clergy, is that sometimes I think they cross the streams a bit, that they forget that as people who are ordained, that have roles as pastors, like a bishop has laid their hands on you, you have made public profession of your call. There is a power that you are given as a pastor to use the actual tools of the church, the powers that are given to you through Scripture, as a way to force the evil in society to be confronted with how evil it actually is. And whether it's Romero's example, another good example for me, I always think of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was back in the 16th century, who himself was a priest, a Dominican, eventually was made a bishop, and how when he was a bishop, he told his priests that any of them that essentially had slaves, that if they had slaves that were working their land, any person that had that was denied communion, which basically meant that you were going to hell. Told his priests that they would be denied communion and they couldn't go to confession either, until they released their servants. That kind of thing is powerful, and I don't believe it to be merely symbolic. So, especially as the kinds of things that we are facing in our country, I really do believe that there is something to say for the role of the church as the church. That we have been given a commission from God through Christ, empowered by the Spirit to be a witness to the transformative reality of God now. And that when we have ways of occupying that role as pastors, as priests, that there is a very uncomfortable decision that people in power have to make. Especially when we show that we ourselves are willing to suffer the consequences of our sins. That we are far more concerned about what God thinks about us and our faithfulness to the call than about what people think about us, be they other bishops, our colleagues, let alone people in our own churches sometimes, or our employers. And Romero, for me, is such a wonderful example of that. I also think that this kind of stance is really important, especially seeing as the way, especially white Protestantism in our country has become completely hijacked by the likes of the people that invaded the Capitol building a few weeks ago. They see no problem at all between what they did, their talk about faith and love and order, and how they don't see any of that as being contrary to the gospel. In fact, they see it as lining up perfectly. Their attack of the Capitol building, it was the Christian thing to do to protect their religious liberties. And I honestly think that taking a classical perspective of our roles as those who are leaders of the church and living those roles in public as religious leaders, using religious language, using the tools of the faith, I think that we can make a very, very powerful social witness. And that's about all I can say about that. But I clearly feel very passionately about this.
Mm-hmm. Shifting gears a little bit, the quote that most closely connects Archbishop Romero to our gospel reading for today is from a conversation that he had with a Guatemalan reporter 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And like you said, his assassination day was March 24th, 1980. So it's coming up what will be this coming week for the Sunday that this is for. And he said, "I have often been threatened with death. If they kill me, I shall arise in the Salvadoran people. If the threats come to be fulfilled, from this moment I offer my blood to God for the redemption and resurrection of El Salvador. Let my blood be a seed of freedom and the sign that hope will soon be reality." And I am reminded in that quote, when I was at LSTC, I worked with Youth in Mission, one of the programs they have for immersion trips and leadership development with high schoolers, and we went to El Salvador with seniors. And I remember a large part of our time there was spent tracing the steps and learning about Archbishop Romero. So we went to the hospital chapel and we saw the place that he was killed and could touch the table at which he was celebrating communion. This quote evokes that sense that he knew he would likely be killed.
Yeah.
And in that chapel, the way that the table is positioned is if you're standing behind the table, you can see all of the people. And in a March day, the doors would be open. And what we were told when we were there is that the car that had the person who killed him drove up, stopped, kept driving, turned around, came back, and then shot him, all while he's presiding at communion, right? And so there's this power, like you were talking about, of what the sacraments mean and what the church means. But for him to see the car, see that it's someone that is clearly there to assassinate him. They keep driving. They turn around. They come back. They roll down the window. They point the gun. And then they kill him. He had so much time. He could have yelled at everybody to leave. He could have ducked behind the altar. And instead of any of those things, knowing that if it was going to happen, it was going to happen sometime, he held up the cup, right? He continued to celebrate communion. Yeah, like those 2 points are just so vivid for me. And when I think about our John reading and particularly this space in the church year that is the last Sunday of Lent, the last Sunday before Palm Sunday and before Holy Week begins, I'm curious what connections you notice between that quote from Romero, but also like the way that he lived his life and approached his death and the connections that we make with this gospel reading of John.
Well, for me, it's a little bit different. So I grew up abandoned, neglected, abused, poverty, roaches in my cereal, all those things. So for me, I have never really been afraid of death. I have always understood death not only as a part of life, but even as a friend and a nurturer and even a lover. So confronting death, understanding it to always be there, is something that just kind of comes naturally to me. And I know that is not common for many folks. And especially because I have friends that, deal with conditions and health issues where death is something that's very present and very real. And so it can be a little bit difficult when I talk like this. But having said that, there is something to say for understanding the witness of the Christian church and understanding that so often what it means to be understood as an exemplar of the faith, indeed to be seen as the most blessed by God, as a servant of the church, is to be martyred. Martyrdom since the beginning of the faith has been seen as a gift. It is a sign of your sanctification and the fact that you have done your work, servant. Now it is now time for you to go home. And that's what I see here. Jesus knows that his time is coming. Everything that he says and everything that he does is not for the sake of calming himself, but rather to give comfort and direction to those around him whom he knows will be devastated by his death. And that's the connection that I see here. It is Jesus doing his best to both accept his fate and to do it with an element of grace and mercy and power without fear, while at the same time doing his best to give his disciples words and thoughts to comfort them in the pain and the fear that will follow in the wake of his assassination. And I find that to be, if there's to be a connection between Romero and the gospel reading here in John, that's sort of where I would put it. when you have become so overwhelmed with God's love and God's concern and God's compassion for the world and those around you, that even the approach of your own death doesn't really shake you, because you know that if it's coming because of your service to God, that in fact what you are being given is a gift. But it's probably a good idea for you to say and do things to help to make sure that those that you love can cope with your death a little better. That's how I see that. And of course, this is a testimony that's common throughout history, right? It's not just Romero. It's really anybody who's been a martyr. You know, when I think about Perpetua and Felicitas, they knew they were dead. They were literal like dog meat, but they were able to approach their death together and in love. I think about Polycarp was an old man when he was martyred. This is all the way back in the 2nd century. And he said, you know, I have lived my life as a Christian and I will die as a Christian. And he was burned alive. Interesting detail. Apparently, martyrs have a smell when they're being burned alive. Apparently, it smelled like bread, which was, you know, because our Lord is bread, right? Isn't that interesting? It was understood that that's what martyrs smelled like when they were burned alive, that it smelled like bread, so they died as our Lord did. I think that this is a powerful tool. I'll be honest, too, I'm also very much an existentialist.
No, I couldn't.
So on some level, this whole sinful nature, total depravity thing, I'm having a hard time not seeing why we shouldn't just take this as a given. I have a compatriot who is working on her PhD at Drew University at the Theological Seminary there. She's Presbyterian. And that is her understanding for environmental degradation. We have had decades as a society to make any number of modifications, changes, advocacy for the sake of the environment. And we have done nothing. We have done virtually nothing. And she said she was just brought to the point where she had its total depravity. It doesn't matter how much knowledge we have, nor how much time we have. It is sin itself that is impeding us from being able to make decisions that will allow our planet to survive. And I have to admit, I'm having a really hard time finding ways to disagree with her. And I've never been fond of the language of total depravity. I'm Lutheran, not Calvin, right? But I'm having a really hard time disagreeing with her. But for me, the thing is that when on some level you embrace that, and the idea that the fights that you do may very well not turn out in your favor, if not, you will always lose. That all the things that you build and that you struggle for and that you fight for can be completely overwritten or destroyed within just a few days. But that doesn't absolve us of the work of the Lord. And it's not about winning. It's never been about winning. The one victory that ever needed to happen happened on the cross. And from that, everything changed. Christ rose from the dead, spread the love of God and the forgiveness of God upon all of creation. And from that point, then, we need never fear for our soul. We need never fear, even in some respects, for our lives, because all of our hairs are counted. And just as God troubles themselves over the fall of a sparrow, so we too are cared for. In the face of such seemingly unstoppable evil, this awareness that we are truly in loved and embraced by God and that we needn't fear for anything, I think is a very powerful religious and psychological stance to take when actively confronting evil. As someone that I can say honestly, myself, who I have done that very consistently over the course of the last few years, I am just incapable of certain kinds of fear. I am incapable of certain kinds of egotism, just because I know if I screw up, I'll find out about it quickly. But in that, there's an acceptance. And that once you accept the sinful nature of life, the sinful nature of everyone, yourself, as well as those whom you love, because of course the people who always hurt us the most are those who we love the most and trust the most. That when you understand that, it actually makes it possible for you to show a greater amount of love, a greater amount of understanding, a greater amount of patience that you wouldn't if you had attached your sense of work and purpose and fortitude to a positive outcome or to the potential for a positive outcome. The gospel reading, much as with the life of Romero, I think really thoroughly embodies that. That you remind yourself of I don't like using the phrase hopelessness. I don't like hope. I don't do hope. I tell people that all the time. But once you embrace just the full difficulty, even the impossibility of a task, and truly accept that, I think the lack of illusion makes the work easier and makes it easier for you to see possibilities that you wouldn't otherwise if the idea of a successful completion was important for you. Because these are all things that I actually really think about quite a bit. You know, what does it mean to be part of a denomination that is likely going to collapse before it even has 1% more people of color among its membership? What does it mean to look for people to become and to support people becoming leaders in the church when you know that seminaries are going to be an impossible burden for the most gifted people in the church, let alone potentially dangerous for them? What do you do when theological education is literally your life's bread? When you know that so many people who go through proper seminary degrees are learning how to be a pastor in a church that hasn't really existed for 50 years? So these are all things that once I have taken that in, that then changes very much how it is that I teach, how I correct student assignments, or even how I talk with people that come to me for help. There was a pastor came to me recently saying that they wanted to do a special Stations of the Cross online because I want to welcome BIPOC and queer people and all of this. And so I asked her, I say, okay, great. Can you do me a favor? When's a time in your life you felt fully welcome? But I tried to get her to give me actual things that people did to welcome her, and she couldn't do it. Simply saying things like, oh, I welcome everybody. Oh, well, I do my best to love people and show them that I care. And I kept saying it, those words mean nothing to me. Mm-hmm. Those words mean absolutely nothing. Yeah. Because that's the equivalent of thoughts and prayers. And that got her.
Yeah. The number of times that I've heard, all are welcome here.
Yeah, it's like this is on my mind a lot.
So one of the themes in this passage is this sense of deep belonging. So throughout Lent, as we've talked about, we've been looking particularly for our Hebrew Bible passages. Our first readings have been a lot about covenants. And the particular way that Jeremiah is talking about the covenant here is this like deep sense of belonging, right? Of things written on our hearts. And it reminded me of one of my favorite book series, which I just found out has another book out that I will be purchasing shortly to read. But the Graceling book series by Kristen Kashor. In the books, the Gracelings have 2 different colored eyes, but they have some ability that far supersedes the best that any normal human could actually do. So it could be that they could fight better than anybody else or swim better than anybody else. And you don't know what your grace is until it kind of manifests itself. So the main character's grace is death. She can kill. And in that realm, it's somewhat fantastical in the sense that there are graces, but it's also kind of medieval. So there's knights and kings and stuff. And in that realm, gracelings, the people with graces, don't belong anywhere. In almost every realm, they are automatically considered property of the king, unless the king doesn't want them. So if your grace is that you can open your mouth as big as your head, you're not actually going to be like of much use to the king. And so you're going to get sent back. And then for a lot of their kingdoms, there's this shame. And even in Leonid, where they revere people with graces, where they hold them up and lift them up and celebrate them, there's still a sense of a conditional belonging, where if the king wanted to, the king could get you into doing the king's work. And so when I think about this deep belonging, I think about what it would look like for gracelings to truly belong and be celebrated without the threat of a king using them or co-opting them or banishing them. As we dive into the verses, in verse 32, Jeremiah quotes God as saying, "It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt." And I just finished season 2 of Avatar Korra, and there's this part where she goes into the spirit realm, and she becomes, I don't know if she's like a toddler or just a little kid. She reminds me of the almost 3-year-old in my life, so I'm going to pretend like she's a toddler.
Or like Boo from Monsters, Inc.
Or like Boo from Monsters, Inc. And she's just amazed and a little bit scared and all this stuff. But then the spirits just take her by the hand and like slowly guide her where she needs to go. And there's a certain extent where then she has to go on by herself. But it's this like beautiful, let me just guide you gently. And that is definitely not the Exodus and how that actually happened. But this telling of it is so gentle and like loving caregiver kind of sense of God. Beautiful.
But yeah, I have a soft spot for this scripture because this is the inspiration behind my first tattoo. I actually have a Jesus fish on my left pec. And I got it precisely because of Jeremiah 31:33. Yeah. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. So that's what I have. I have a Jesus fish on my heart with the Greek letters in it. And the nerdy part of me is when I use it as an illustration for some aspects of the faith. When you look at it, it basically takes two circles overlapping to make it. So I kind of like that there's the idea sort of an infinity loop of sorts. Plus, it's a fish, which is good because the first disciples were fishermen. And that's kind of a major theme. One of the miracles is Peter pulling up the nets and it's filled with fish. The fact that you can't have fish without water. Water being important not only just for baptism, but for all of life. My mother also talked about how even the fish itself was a subversive symbol, because in the first century, when Christians were still actively being hunted down and persecuted, people would show to one another that they were Christians by drawing the fish symbol in the ground. But also, I would learn later that having a fish in your house as a symbol of your faith, if you were questioned about it, you could say, oh, no, we belong to the cult of Poseidon, basically, or Neptune, because it was also symbolized by a fish. So I just really like the richness of the symbolism. Again, I didn't mean to do this, but it also was an excellent evangelism tool. Not long after I got the tattoo, I was working as a bartender, or even just in general, whenever I'm walking around and I'm wearing a white shirt, people could easily see through it. And so invariably, it led to any and all kinds of conversations, but especially when I was tending bar. And some of the first times I had to give testimony for my faith were in a bar in the red light district in Geneva, Switzerland. And so it was really kind of cool having conversations with bar patrons that were people that were in business. There are a lot of individuals that were active in global activism in Geneva, Switzerland with NGOs. Quite a few church people also in Geneva, Switzerland. The World Council of Churches and the Lutheran World Federation are based there. And then, of course, you're also in Paquis, which is red light district. So there were quite a number of sex workers that were there too. Cisgender, transgender, and invariably, I would have many conversations with them about my Christian faith because of my tattoo. I've had it now for almost 20 years, so I do tend to forget it's there, but occasionally I have a reminder, especially like when I run across the scripture.
I also have a tattoo. I have a couple tattoos, but one of them is Ichthus. It's 7 of them, so it's rainbow ones, and then the final one is white, which for my skin color blends in, so it's not always visible to people. And it is, there's a lot of those similar connections with both baptism. Both of my tattoos that I have right now are connected to the sacraments, and so a baptism thing, but also it's on my foot, and so there's a journeying and a movement and a not always visible and a queerness to it.
When we reach verse 34, God says, "No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, 'Know the Lord,' for they shall all know me." And just to be clear, when you're thinking about the mood or the emotion that God is trying to put into these words, I would say probably don't think of Galadriel in Lord of the Rings when she is offered the ring by Frodo, who imagines herself as an evil queen and says, "All shall love me in despair," except that is totally not a good version of her voice. But yes, I love that line. Listen, sometimes you just have to imagine yourself as the evil queen and have the moment, and then after that you're fine, but you have to get through that moment first. On the other hand, I would say that if you want to go for what is God going for when God says, "All shall know me," maybe try Donkey from Shrek saying, "Everybody likes parfaits." So,
like that, those are like the two ends, like, "All shall know me in despair." Everybody knows me.
Honestly, I wasn't planning on Donkey showing up, but I was doing the Galadriel line in my head, and suddenly Donkey was there and suggesting parfaits, and I don't have control over my brain. I think we all know that. So,
I think in the next version of Lord of the Rings, they will be played by characters from Shrek, and Donkey shall be Lady Galadriel. Yeah. Our second reading is Hebrews chapter 5, verses 5 through 10. Jesus, the new high priest, has become the source of everlasting salvation. So one of the themes that came up for me in this passage is the roles that happen in it, right? So we hear about Jesus as the high priest. We think about like priest and pastor and deacon and prophet and counselor and theologian in residence, and the many different names that we have, particularly for rostered ministers, but also for people of faith at every level of the church. That we have Archbishop Óscar Romero, who affectionately is Monsignor Óscar Romero, a Monsignor in the Catholic Church. And when I was in El Salvador, the people who loved him didn't call him Archbishop, they called him Monsignor. So there's just the different roles that we have, that sometimes we have the same roles, but we are experienced in different ways, and sometimes we have very different ways. So it's kind of, in some ways, the opposite of the book Divergent, at least at the beginning, where each of the different factions of abnegation, erudite, dauntless, candor, and amity, I had to look those up to double check because it's been so long, have a different role in the functioning of the community. And yet, there's factionless, and there are divergents, people who are divergent who have multiple of those main characteristics and traits, and so their roles are not as clear, even when the rest of the culture tries to fit them into the box of whichever faction they're in or decide to go into. But yeah, I think also about the ways that we talk about pastors can be pastors or prophets, without recognizing that sometimes to be pastoral is to be prophetic, and sometimes to be prophetic is to be pastoral, that those aren't. Sometimes they're different roles, and sometimes they're not.
And also, all the rostered leaders and many other church leaders that I've known have acknowledged the fact that there is a certain X factor to the job of, and whatever else seems necessary at the time, which may or may not include cleaning the bathroom or dealing with rodents that may be alive or dead. And I suppose that role might be parallel to the factionless, in terms of it's just, it's not really part of the job description, but you're going to do it anyway.
That makes sense.
In verse 6, Jesus is specifically named high priest as according to the order of Melchizedek, who is a biblical historical person. Melchizedek is also the name that Sarah Crewe, the protagonist of The Little Princess, which was a novel I really loved as a kid, gives her little mouse friend when she is a penniless maid and living in an attic, and the mouse is her only friend. So on top of the inherent silliness of giving such an extraordinary name to a tiny, ordinary mouse, I do, as I get older, I think that the idea that she's naming this ordinary mouse a high priest has a certain parallel to the idea of Jesus becoming human for us, the Son of God being fully human on our behalf. Jesus was not quite a mouse, you might say, but there's a little bit of a parallel to that, and the older I get, the more I kind of like the idea that maybe that was a intentional theological choice on behalf of this fictional 11-year-old.
I was wondering if you were going to make this connection, because now every time I read this, I think of Melchizedek. I've never read The Little Princess, and
I think I brought this up now 3 times on the podcast, although the previous 2 times were in our previous
I know, so this is the first time for this one.
But listen, the name Melchizedek is awesome enough that we need to make hay of it.
No, I was hoping you would bring it up. Now it's not even a jump away from Harry Potter. It's just a natural part of the...
It is also one of those names that you just know church people are going to name their pets that. That's how that works. There are a handful of names that go for that, Ignatius being another popular one. My cat is named Magdalena, so I really can't argue. But...
I have no pets, and I'm glad for it. I also think it's interesting because tzedek, for me, is connected. I think the way that we have it spelled in Hebrews doesn't quite match up, but the tzedek part is like justice, right, in Hebrew. And so that's the piece that I always connect it to. Yeah, to thinking about what does it look like to be of justice in Hebrews. And then in verse 7, we read that Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. And if this were any fairy tale whatsoever, the reason that Jesus was heard would, of course, be because of the tears, because it is the magical drop of that single tear falling down the face and landing on whatever that hoped or longed for thing is, or Earth itself.
Yes.
That in fact is the reason everything changes in almost every fairy tale.
Our gospel reading for today is John chapter 12, verses 20 through 33. Having entered Jerusalem for what will be the final time, Jesus speaks to a crowd about what following him really means and what his death will bring about.
So one of the themes in this passage is impending doom.
Dum, dum.
Which is to say, Jesus is hinting at that he is going to die, and he knows it. And this happens, as I have probably already mentioned, though you'll notice that my mentions of the Ember in the Ashes series have decreased because I finished them and have moved on to other books, but I still love them. So there is this sense throughout the books, and there's a little bit of a spoiler for the fourth book if you haven't read it yet. It just came out in December, so warnings there. But there's this sense of impending doom, both when the Bloodstrike comes back without Elias and is supposed to be bringing Elias back to be executed. And so there's this impending doom of something bad is going to happen, and in fact does. And that's in the second book. But then also there's one point where the ghosts are about to escape and you can feel it building and the pressure building before the barrier breaks and they get out, and there's lots of death and destruction and things. And then even to the very end where there's this constant dreaming by multiple characters of this maelstrom coming, this giant storm that's powerful and going to wreak havoc and destruction everywhere because the storm is in fact suffering itself. So there's this like impending doom with what Jesus is saying too, of everything's going to be destroyed. And not necessarily he's saying everything at this point, but he will be destroyed, right? His death will come and will come soon. So in verse 24 we read, "Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." So there is, of course, the obvious connection that we talked about in our deep dive between Óscar Romero and thinking about Jesus as a martyr and someone who's part of a resistance movement and then is assassinated because of it. And there's this connection of seeing the inevitable and seeing that it is likely that they will be killed, and this language of death and resurrection that the wheat gives us. And it's science!
Yay, science!
There's this cycle of life and growth and death, and it is that cycle that produces the grains of wheat that then fall and then are buried and watered, and there's sun, and they grow and become new stalks of wheat and then scattered. And
see, and as a Lutheran nerd, I'm amazed that you managed to do that whole thing without accidentally quoting Marty Haugen, as the grains of wheat.
Oh, it was in my head. As the grains of wheat went scattered on the hill. Also, this is what we did for Trinity Las Americas, where I serve for Lent. Instead of doing ashes for Ash Wednesday, during our Ash Wednesday service, we had made Lenten kits for everybody, and we gave everybody a pot and some seeds. And then on Ash Wednesday, we planted the seeds and watered them, and they grew over the course of Lent.
Cool.
And so we have been having people take pictures of their plants as they grow, and then we'll have them on for our Easter episode. For our Easter worship. You know.
I have heard of people doing the whole plant thing during Lent, and it can be lovely. However, I have also been warned you don't want to do that with a kid under 4, because if the plant dies, they will be horrified and they will be convinced that they personally killed Jesus.
So we're doing it with every household gets one plant, and every household gets at least 5 seeds. So
excellent.
We got some backups there.
Okay. And then in verse 26, we hear Jesus say, "Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also." Following Jesus means that you don't always get to go where you want to go, or get to do what you want to do. And as far as nerdery goes, there are very few nerds in this universe, like British naval history nerds, and there was once a movie made for them called Master and Commander.
I remember that movie.
And apparently they had, when it came to properly portraying a British naval captain, they had to find a New Zealander to do it, which many people have apparently found amusing. But there is a repeated line in Master and Commander about being subject to the requirements of the service. There are things that the various characters all want to do. They all want to go off and pursue their various interests, but it is constantly reminded to them that they are not on their own. They are subject to the requirements of the naval service. They have to do their job before they get to go off and do their interesting bits. And then this is very sweetly subverted at one point when subject to the requirements of the service is turned in such a way as to save one person's life, which happens to be the person that kept getting what they wanted to do taken away from them over and over and over again. And then their life was put in danger, and they were allowed to spend their time healing at the place they had always wanted to go. So that was very sweet. Nice. And that character was played by Paul Bettany, who's actually British, so you never know. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Palm Sunday with our special guest, Pastor Lenny Duncan. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.